The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. On behalf of the World Health Organization Center for Aging and Life Course and the International Federation on Aging, I'd like to welcome you all to the fifth in a series of age-friendly webinars. Today's webinar is called Rural and Remote Age-Friendly Communities and will be presented by Dr. Verena Mennick. Dr. Mennick is a professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences, College of Medicine at the University of Manitoba. She served as the director of the Center on Aging at the University of Manitoba from 2004 to 2014 and has also served on numerous advisory committees, including the Canadian Institute of Health Research, Institute of Aging's Advisory Board from 2005 to 2011. She has been the recipient of numerous research grants, including a Canadian Research Chair in Healthy Aging from 2004 to 2014. She is currently the Manitoba lead of the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, a large national study that will follow approximately 50,000 men and women between the ages of 45 and 85 for at least 20 years. Dr. Mennick's main research interests lie in the areas of healthy aging, determinants of healthy aging, age-friendly communities, and social isolation. On behalf of the IFA, I'd like to thank Dr. Mennick for presenting today. The IFA invites all participants to ask questions via the Questions tab on the GoToWebinars. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar, but should your question not be answered, I would invite you to follow up with the IFA via the contact information that will be sent out following the webinar in our wrap-up email. Thank you, and go ahead, Dr. Mennick.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction, and I'm delighted to be here and have been asked to give a webinar on age-friendly rural and remote communities. Just to say up front that I work in a Canadian context, specifically in Manitoba, so some of my examples and pictures will be Canadian and Manitoba, and you can see on my first slide I have a Manitoba sky, but I do hope that some of what I have to say will resonate with experiences in other countries, or that perhaps at the end we can have a discussion of how things might be different in other contexts. So I have two questions that I want to address in this webinar, and one is what does age-friendliness mean in the context of rural and remote communities? And then secondly, what factors help or hinder rural and remote communities in becoming more age-friendly? Implicit in this is a comparison between urban and rural. Are there differences between urban and rural areas? Now, before I can talk about my questions, I really need to set the stage and ask the question, what is rural? So what do I mean by rural and remote? I've given a little write-up from Statistics Canada, which I like a lot because it simply says that we intuitively kind of know what we mean by urban. And it means there are a lot of people in a small area, and we kind of all know when we see rural, and it means there's not a lot of people and there's a lot of space. But when we want to look at it more closely, we really need a better definition. So from a research perspective or planning perspective. Two general comments about that, though. There really is no one definition. When you look at how rural is defined or remote, there's a lot of variation in different countries, within countries. And typically, though, it is defined as what is left after urban is defined. So it's kind of we're defining first urban, and then after that, what is left is defined as rural. Below my two bullets, I have a table that comes from a European Union document that talks about harmonization of definitions of rural and urban. So first urban, and then by definition what's left is rural. And it really goes into great detail about the complexities of defining rural and urban. I think it's a very nice report, but very broadly speaking, we can just say that urban areas kind of, again, intuitively are intermediate in density or densely populated. So towns, suburbs, cities would be included in urban. And then what else is left are those areas that are thinly populated. And we would call those rural areas. What's not in this definition here is remote. And again, the definition of remote would vary, and it's not an easy one to do. I had a colleague who was working on rural issues here in Manitoba, and she used to joke that remote is where there is not even a Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons being a very popular coffee shop in Manitoba. Now that is a joke, but I think it gets at the point that remote is really, really far away. It's very sparsely populated, and it's even further away from everything than rural. Besides thinking about towns, suburbs, cities versus those other areas, they could be villages, small settlements, I want to briefly touch on the issue of location, which is another important factor to consider. So let me try to illustrate this with an example. Here you have some pictures on the left. The two pictures are from rural Canada. I think we could agree those are rural. There's not a lot, well, there's really nobody around except an ice fisher at the bottom. There's also very sparsely populated. On the right side, we have two other pictures at the top from the Swiss Alps, just because I like mountains. I like that picture. And at the bottom, though, there is a village of, also in Switzerland, of less than 150 people. I think by any definition that would qualify as rural. Now, keep the bottom picture in mind, and I will show you a Google map, and focus first on the bottom of the slide. It shows where that small village of less than 150 people is located. And according to Google Distance Calculator, it takes 11 minutes by car to go to the next larger town, which is most definitely already urban. And when you go a little bit to the right, and you can make that out fairly well, not that easily, but you can make it out that there is an even larger urban center. What you can also see is that there are a lot of roads, and what you might be less well to see, but I can tell you, there's also a train line connecting these places, and it's a very well-traveled train line. So we have a small town, rural, but it is very close to urban centers, and it's highly connected. Now, go above. There's also a Google map of a small Canadian Manitoba town, which one could also classify as rural. But if you drove 11 minutes from that small town, you would really not go, well, very far. I mean, in terms of getting anywhere, you would still see fields, you would see some cattle, and you're definitely not within an urban center yet. There are some roads for sure. Some of those will be gravel roads, and there is no train line in sight. So my point here is simply to say that what is rural is important, but also where settlements, small villages, are located in relation to other urban centers, and how well they are connected with in terms of train systems, road systems, and so on. A general pattern worldwide has been urbanization, and here are some world figures. So the world's, what's plotted here is the proportion of the population worldwide that lives in rural areas, and that has declined from 1960, where it was just above 65, down to 46% currently. So quite a decline, and that is the result of out-migration out of rural areas into cities. So cities are becoming larger. In Canada, we have the same trend here. We can go back, this graph goes back to 1851, where almost 90% of the Canadian population was rural, living in rural areas, and now it's down to 19%. Let me just note here that when we do these comparisons, when you look at the comparisons, you do want to look at how rural is defined. And I would say in terms of how Canada, and this is Statistics Canada, defines rural, it's quite conservative. So they're working with a definition of rural being 1,000 people or 1,000 or more residents in an area, and with a density of 400 people per square kilometers, with some additional conditions around that, but that's the core idea. To me, I have, working in a Manitoba context, that sounds very conservative, because when we look at some of the rural towns, what I would call rural towns, they would actually qualify as urban according to that Statistics Canada definition. So I think when I look at that 19%, that's a little low for certain areas. Overall, though, clearly there's urbanization happening, but at the same time, I would flip that around and say a lot of people worldwide live in rural areas, rural and remote areas. So that's one thing. That's so rural and remote is important. There are a lot of people living there. Why else then should we care about rural and remote communities? Well, as it turns out, a lot of older people do live in rural areas worldwide. 42% of individuals 60-plus-year-old live in rural areas. So that's a lot of people. That's almost half of the population of 60-plus-year-olds. Secondly, why should we care about rural and remote communities? I think older people should be able to age in place in their community. So if they do live in rural areas, those rural communities, rural places should be able to accommodate their needs, so people don't have to move away. Another point is that older people do contribute to the sustainability of rural and remote communities. Older people, they shop, they provide employment opportunities, they participate in the community. So if rural communities start to lose their older people, they may not be able to be sustainable. And another point is that urban centers need rural communities and vice versa. I think without rural, urban cannot exist. And I've given and these are again Canadian pictures, some examples of agricultural and energy. But I mean, more broadly, we could also argue that we need nature. So we do need rural. So with that backdrop, then, in terms of what I mean by rural and remote, let's go to age-friendly. And let me start off with a World Health Organization definition of what is age-friendly. That an age-friendly city is one where policies, services, and structures related to the physical and social environment support older people and enable older people to stay healthy, feel safe, and participate in society. According to the WHO, there are 8 age-friendly domains that range from outdoor spaces and buildings to transportation, housing, respect and social inclusion, to social participation, communication and information, civic participation and employment, right down to community support and health services. So a broad range of domains are thought important. In 2007, based on focus groups that were conducted in cities around the world, the WHO released a guide, which I've displayed here, the Global Age-Friendly Cities, a guide to help cities become more age-friendly. And the guide lists a lot of specific features that make a city age-friendly in the 8 domains that I just mentioned. So it's a whole long list of specific aspects of an age-friendly city. In 2007, Canada released, so the Canadian government released a parallel guide focusing on rural and remote communities. That guide was developed in a very similar way as the WHO guide, in that it was based on focus group research conducted in towns and villages in Canada. They were rural and remote in the sense of having populations less than 5,000. And the question was the same. So what are the specific features of age-friendly, of rural and remote communities? So what then does age-friendliness mean in the context of rural and remote communities? So I can get to that question. Let me give you a few examples. Now, I can certainly not do justice to the age-friendly rural and remote guide. If you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to take a look at that. But let me give you a few examples. And here you have the age-friendly domain according to the WHO. I'll go in clockwise around the pictures here, starting with outdoor spaces and buildings. For example, sidewalks are well maintained. Are there public washrooms? Is there affordable housing? Are seniors treated respectfully in the community? Are they included in community decisions? Would be examples of respect and social inclusion. In terms of health services, is there medical equipment available? Are there health services? Or is there, for example, is there a physician available? In terms of civic participation, employment, are there volunteer opportunities, employment opportunities? Is there distribution of information about events and programs? Is there access to computers and internet? Would be examples of communication and information. Are there activities for seniors? By the way, on the left-hand side, you would see a picture of some men curling, a very common sport in Manitoba, where every small town does have a curling rink. It's a very fun game. And above that, transportation. Are the roads well maintained? Are there buses or vans available? So that's just a few examples of what people said in rural and remote Canadian communities. Now you might say, well, that doesn't sound a whole lot different from what one might hear in an urban center, and I would agree. What emerged in terms of age-friendly features in rural and remote communities is actually quite similar to what emerges in an urban center. What I do think is very different is how rural and remote gives a different context for how these features play themselves out. And I will go into that in a moment in further detail. Another thing you might say is, well, this doesn't sound like communities in other parts of the world, and especially when you look at the picture. So how does this apply to different contexts? Well, let me give you maybe different pictures to illustrate how some of these features or different aspects might actually apply to other contexts. So maybe curling, which is a really big thing in Manitoba specifically, is not something that people do in other cultures, in other countries, but the idea that people are doing something, that there's activities, is important. Transportation, I showed a picture of a bus. Maybe a bicycle or walking is the mode of transportation that's important. So, but still the bottom line is transportation. People need to get around. Apartments may not be an issue, and in some contexts it may be more important that their basic needs are met, maybe that there's running water, that there's electricity, or that there's firewood available. So the domains would apply equally well in other contexts, but you would have to, but the specific examples would need to be modified, and one would want to see what actually matters in a specific context, in a specific country, in a specific cultural context. So I mentioned just a moment ago that maybe the features in a rural remote community are not that different from what you might hear about in an urban setting, but really what sets rural and urban apart are some of the unique challenges that you see in a rural and remote context. And here are just some of them, and please feel free to use the chat box to give additional ones. Some of the ones that I've listed here are most definitely interrelated. So when we think about inadequate infrastructure, that might be the road systems, or lack thereof. Buildings may not be there, facilities are not available. Some of that it would be certainly related, very much related to the geographic distances. Which is interrelated then with limited availability of services and lack of specialized expertise. So, for example, in many rural areas in Canada, towns, small villages are having difficulty attracting and retaining health human resources such as physicians or nurses. In terms of just the pictures here, the bottom one is a picture of road that was just opened up very recently in the Northwest Territories in Canada that leads from Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk, which is up the Arctic Circle. So that is, I think by any definition, very, very remote, and that road is making now the town of Tuktoyaktuk accessible year-round. Before it was only accessible in the winter by an ice road. So we have these challenges of inadequate infrastructure, geographic distances. We also have small budgets. Small towns have small budgets. They also have more difficulties attracting resources, again, because of those issues around geographic distances and those small budgets to begin with. The last two points are a little bit different, but you may have conflicts in a small village. So the small town politics is in quotation marks there, and I'm simply mentioning that because while the conflicts may exist in an urban center, for sure it may be easier to avoid those by simply going around different groups, and whereas in a small town they may be very much more apparent simply because a small town is so small. Lack of political wills would apply to any place, urban or rural, but it may affect rural more so because there's no capacity for, there's no buffer zone, if you will. So if there's a lack of political will to make a community more age-friendly or to focus on a certain issue, it may really affect that community. So challenges then, in terms of age-friendly barriers, can be magnified in rural and remote areas. They may be the same, so transportation will be an issue in urban areas just as much as in rural, but in rural areas these are magnified. And here I've given an example of a quote from one of my research participants who, and actually the picture is from the participant as well, who are saying that seniors on a limited income use this mode of transportation, and that refers to the bus. The trip is 9 hours and it's very uncomfortable, and that would be to a 9-hour trip to access probably health services in Winnipeg, so in the south of the province. Let me just note here that I'm not trying to set up a false dichotomy between urban and rural and suggest that things are bad in rural and they're good in an urban center. We know, of course, that in cities there are often poor neighborhoods where there are also many challenges. And if you go to the extreme of slums, where we have people living in conditions where they lack even the most basic amenities. What I am trying to say, though, is that in general, on the whole, rural and remote communities will have challenges that affect how age-friendly they are and how age-friendly, how easily they can become more age-friendly. Now, on the positive side, rural and remote communities can also have strengths, and there can be specific opportunities in rural and remote, or perhaps more so rural communities. There can be strong social ties. People know each other. They have to live together, so they maybe try to get along, where compared in an urban center where one can stay anonymous and really does not have to know one's neighbor. There can be a very strong sense of place, a sense of rootedness. People want to age there in their community where they've grown up, where their family has been for maybe generations. Politically, local leaders are accessible just because it's small, because people know each other, and that can make it easier to have an impact. So people can make their voices heard perhaps more easily than in an urban center, where there's a lot more bureaucracy, lots of red tape, layers of red tape to go through. It can be easier to engage residents in a rural community, in a small settlement. Going from door to door becomes possible. Again, people know each other. A town hall meeting might attract most of the town. There is a sense of being self-reliant, do-it-yourself attitude, and we can do this ourselves because we have to have been doing it ourselves all along. That kind of attitude. There can be existing collaborations and partnerships that can also help a community move forward as they are trying to become more age-friendly. So these are partnerships that have been established just because it's a small community and people do have to work together. Organizations have to work together already. So there's a strong basis to work from. And my last point here, economic development opportunities, by that I simply mean that some rural communities may take advantage of the fact that they are rural and may maximize on that, for example, by defining themselves as a retirement community, and so can start to be able to attract other seniors into the community. So there are unique challenges in rural and remote communities, but there are also certain strengths. Now, let me talk a little bit more in detail about factors that help communities become more age-friendly, and then also what factors can represent challenges. And some of these come from research I've conducted in Manitoba, so in the context of rural and remote communities in Manitoba. I think in terms of the factors that help communities become more age-friendly, when you look at the list, and I'll go through it in a moment, I don't actually think they're very different from urban centers. I think these are important regardless of the size, location of the community you're talking about. Strong leadership anywhere is important. There needs to be some type of steering committee, advisory committee that can guide a process to make a community more age-friendly. A champion really helps. So if there's no champion, it becomes harder to make a community more age-friendly. And a champion will somebody who can be, who has a vision, who can sell a vision that age-friendly is good, that it's great for a community, and has that energy and brings that voice to the agenda. A champion, by the way, can be anybody. It can be a group of people. It can be a political leader, but not necessarily so. It can be a senior. It can be just somebody who has that vision and that passion for age-friendliness. There need to be some type of community consultations to identify need, and identify the need from the perspective of seniors. What those look like will differ across the community. So there may be a town hall meeting, it may be more research type of approach, but some type of consultation is needed. Integrating age friendliness with other initiatives or strategies really helps. Going just with age friendliness can be difficult in a small community, particularly. So for example, linking it to other initiatives like oh, there are many of them, but maybe there's a chronic disease prevention initiative going on at the same time. There may be something like a complete streets initiative going on. Whatever there's already happening, tying age friendliness to that helps. Promotion needs and awareness raising needs to be happening at the beginning of the initiative, but needs to keep going because people turn over, people forget, and so ongoing promotion is really, really important. Intersectoral partnerships, I already mentioned that or alluded to that earlier. It's important to recognize that age friendliness cannot happen through one group alone. It needs interdepartmental, intersectoral partnerships, nonprofit organizations. It's just simply too big to tackle for any one group alone. What are then some of the challenges in becoming age friendly? And I think here these are magnified in rural and remote communities precisely because of some of the factors I mentioned earlier. Size is important, so the capacity issue is a big one. In a small community, volunteer burnout is a real danger when the same people are doing yet again something else. It comes onto the shoulders of the same people to deal with age friendliness. The same with lack of leadership and direction. There may simply not be enough capacity to take on yet another project, another age-friendly project, even though everybody recognizes that it's important, but there may simply be a lack of capacity to initiate it and sustain it. Funding is a big challenge in smaller communities. I'm not saying it's not an issue in urban centers, but it is also a very big challenge in rural and remote communities. So especially with dealing with larger projects like housing, transportation, those are challenging to implement, as is healthcare services. Those are very large issues. There may be competing priorities. Again, of course, that applies to urban centers as well, but becomes really evident in rural and remote communities where there is very limited funds, where there's competing demands. Maybe infrastructure demands, the road demands to keep the roads maintained, and then older people may simply not be a priority. Offloading of responsibilities onto local governments, we've seen that happening in the last, well, 3 decades or so, 2-3 decades. For sure, it's increasing happening that local governments are supposed to be responsible for providing services, and that can be a tremendous challenge for rural and remote communities because they lack the capacity, they lack the funds. Just to note, though, that those are not the only issues that can affect rural and remote communities. Rural remote communities are diverse, as I mentioned before. They're different in size. They're also different in location. So like the example I gave earlier, a small community that's very close to an urban center is a very different context than a remote community that is very, very far away from some other amenities in another community, and that creates challenges. There may be regionally competitive communities, and a picture on the right side at the bottom shows one of those in Manitoba. So that's Gimli, Manitoba. It's become a retirement community, but it's really benefited from being close to a lake. So it's a very nice setting, and it's attracting, therefore, seniors into it. So that's helped him the community become more age-friendly because of that, because it's attracted seniors in. The demographic composition of how it impacts priorities and funding. What I mean by that is that, let's say, a very young community, so a community that has a lot of young residents may simply not see it necessary to become more age-friendly. That may not be a priority, which gets back to the issue around competing priorities. There are maybe other priorities that can make it either challenging for the community become more age-friendly, or may actually help. So, for example, an older community may actually need to become more age-friendly, and that will facilitate the process of doing so. By history, I mean, well, we know communities differ. They differ for many, many reasons, including history. For example, there may be different cultural groups within a community. They may work together, or they may not historically work together, and that in turn can either help or hinder the community from becoming more age-friendly. And then social capital. Some communities, some rural communities are better able to mobilize people than others, and that may be for a variety of reasons. Some may be historical, or maybe other factors at play. Let me just illustrate or give an example of how some of the factors that I just talked about can affect a community. And let me explain what I'm showing here. I'm showing a graph that has 46 bars, and each one of the bars shown here represents a community in Manitoba. So there are 46 communities listed. The height of the bar is the age-friendliness of the community, and that is determined based on a survey that was given to community residents. So residents in each of those communities filled out a questionnaire, and the questionnaire involved a whole bunch of questions related to age-friendliness in the various domains, housing, transportation, and so on. And so there was a rating, and this is added up, and we get an average score for the community. So first of all, to note here is that there's a lot of variability in how age-friendly communities already are, and that's before they did anything to become more age-friendly, so the baseline, if you will. So the communities on the left side, they are relatively not age-friendly to begin with. Actually, they score quite low on this index. And then on the right side, we have some communities that are already quite age-friendly, so quite a lot of variability. So if we took a hypothetical ideal age-friendly score, let's say we think that communities should be at that green line. The communities on the left side have a lot further to go than the communities on the right side of this graph. So in other words, those who start off already at a disadvantage are going to have a much more difficult road ahead of them. They have a lot further to go. And so the same factors that may impact, that may be responsible for them being lower to begin with, may also prevent those communities from actually reaching that hypothetical ideal age-friendliness score. So presumably, looking at that, then one would think that the communities on the left side, who are already to begin with disadvantaged and have so much further to go, would also benefit from more help, so such as help with human resources and financial support. So let me just draw some general conclusions to end off here. First of all, I hope to have conveyed that rural and remote communities are unique, and that deserve specific policy and research attention. I think, so just speaking from a research perspective, often there's not as much attention paid on rural and remote communities as there is on urban centers. I also hope to have conveyed that all the people living in rural and remote communities do face unique issues. So again, they deserve our attention. The third point here on the slide, I've actually not really highlighted very much, but I do want to just mention it here. I do think it's important to consider age-friendliness as a holistic concept. Age-friendly domains are interrelated and they should not be looked at in isolation. So I think it is important to keep track of all of the domains, even though that may be difficult at once. And to give you an example, I think tackling housing without also considering transportation is a mistake. So for example, a small town may have cheap land, and this is in a Manitoba context where rural land is very cheap, so there may be cheap land outside the community, and the community may consider putting some senior housing there, but by doing so and not thinking about transportation, they have just created a potential transportation problem if people who live there cannot drive. So looking at the domains as being interrelated, I think, is important. So in terms of then of helping age-friendly, rather to help rural and remote communities become more age-friendly, I do think it's important to have a bottom-up and top-down approach. The bottom-up would be that there's community involvement for sure. Communities need to identify their own needs. Age-friendliness needs to suit the community's interests and specific local context, but there needs to be some top-down government policy approach in the sense of helping the community become age-friendly, because a lot of the issues that rural communities, remote communities are faced cannot be changed at the local level, like housing, like transportation. There needs to be collaboration and partnerships. I've said that before, but I want to just highlight it yet again. A common vision, equitable partnerships, and even though there are many partnerships, they're not necessarily equitable. People working towards a common goal to make a community more age-friendly. Related to what I've said above, there's a need to go beyond the local, I believe. A rural or remote community, I believe, cannot become age-friendly without some more higher level help. Regional partnerships can help, for example, in the transportation domain. Rural communities may struggle to deal with their transportation problems on their own, so a regional partnership may actually benefit everybody. The issue around broader policy changes, for example, again, with the big issues, healthcare cannot be solved at the local level. It needs a top-down, larger policy change, and depending on the context that one is working in, that may mean provincial context, in a Canadian context, state, federal policy. And I do believe there need to be broader age-friendly coalitions. Again, going beyond the local. Age-friendly tends to be happening at the local level. For sure, it needs to be at the local level, but yet can be supported by age-friendly coalitions. And I should have used a different term in the brackets there. I put local. What I mean by local is not local community level, but I meant a more provincial, in a Canadian context, state, whatever your system looks like. National coalitions, international coalitions that help communities locally become more age-friendly. So I will leave you with, again, a Manitoba picture, a Manitoba sky, and that completes my presentation, and I'm open to questions or comments.
Thank you, Dr. Menick, for that fantastic presentation. I have a few questions and comments, but I'd like to invite anybody else who has questions or comments to send them through the questions tab. But I'll get started and then I'll give you a moment to respond. The first comment is, another challenge is distance from urban-centered decision makers who don't need to understand rural living, so a country mouse versus city mouse situation. And then I'll let you comment on that. That was a comment that we received.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. You know, it just resonates particularly here in Manitoba, where we have decisions being made in the one city, Winnipeg, and there's a phrase called perimeteritis. So people do not go beyond the perimeter of Winnipeg, and yet decisions are made that affect rural areas, and it really relates to that lack of recognition that rural is important and rural is different, and political will, policy will, which is on my last slide, I had this issue around going beyond the local. There are things that cannot be changed in rural, remote communities without that larger political will, and often that larger, let's say, provincial political will here in Canada, it comes out of cities. So there's the lack of awareness. I agree.
Okay, the next question is related to the survey that you mentioned that was given out to communities. And the question was simply whether the survey is available for others to use in similar situations.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. The person who made the comment can contact me. It's not published. It's in there's examples in a paper that is published in Aging and Society, so to look at. So yes, I can certainly make it available. I would caution people to really take a look at the questions, because they may not apply to your context. So as I was trying to convey with my different pictures there, that it really depends on the local context, what kind of questions you would want to ask. And so the questions we have are made sense in a Manitoba context, but may simply not be relevant to whatever context you're working in.
Thank you. The next comment and question is as follows. I appreciate the point that different communities have different baseline levels. Sorry, one second. Different baseline levels of readiness for age-friendly community change. Does the Canadian government and other funders give more money or resources to underrepresented communities that need additional time and people power to achieve meaningful community-level change?
I can't give you a Canadian answer, because HFriendly rolls out differently in different provinces. Well, to backtrack slightly, all provinces, all 10 provinces in Canada have now HFriendly initiatives underway. How they're so that means that the provincial government is supporting communities in whatever way, or promoting age-friendly for communities in that province. How the province implements those initiatives differs across the provinces. In general, there's been, in terms of age-friendly grants, they tend to be, and it's a generalization, but they tend to be similar for all communities. So the answer would be generally no. There is no recognition that some have a bigger road ahead of them than other communities. And I would say that would be something that would be really nice to if that changed.
Thank you. The next question is, where there may be a lack of local political will, have you seen success in a regional, i.e. non-urban entity, i.e. academic, government, healthcare, or nonprofit, in pushing the age-friendly agenda in a community?
Could you repeat that?
Sure. Sorry. Where there may be a lack of local political will, have you seen success in a regional entity, i.e. academic, government, healthcare, or nonprofit, in pushing the age-friendly agenda in said community?
Yes, I have seen that. So the agenda can be pushed from various sources, and certainly you could have a community where either academics would push the agenda. Okay, that's one thing. Or you could have, let's say, a senior group. I've also seen it. A senior group in a community was really pushing the age-friendly agenda ahead, and that works okay up to a certain point. I think where the problem starts to arise when you have to make changes, and some of the decisions will happen need the political buy-in, they need the municipal buy-in. So there's a real danger in well, it's not a danger. I think that the impetus can be given, but then there needs to be some municipal involvement. Otherwise, the initiative stops. I think the best case scenario, everybody works together from the beginning, which would be ideal. So everybody, that means also the municipality gets involved, and ideally, at some point, the municipality actually starts to put age-friendly right into its budget. So it becomes ingrained as within the municipal structure. Otherwise, you run the danger of some group, whoever that is, in a sense, trying to push an agenda but not being able to make decisions. Having said that, of course, as an academic or as an age friend, a senior group, you can make certain changes, but really, if we look at age-friendly as being more holistic, a lot of the decisions do lie with municipal government. And then let me go more broadly than that, and some of the decisions don't need to go beyond the local. It needs to go beyond the local because some decisions are dependent on policy changes, on funding at a higher level. And this will differ from country to country, but in Canada, they will be lying with the provincial government. And that is healthcare, there's some transportation issues, housing strategy, and also provincial and federal. So,
thank you. The next question is there any evidence that technology is encouraging young people or people in general to populate or stay in rural communities if they can work via telenetworking or other mediums like that?
Oh, interesting question. I don't know. I would say no, but if somebody else has the answer to that question, I would like to hear that. I think we're still seeing out migration, which suggests to me no, but who knows?
Okay, so the next question is, living in a province that is primarily rural, and where rural communities are working well on their own, how do we engage communities at a regional level to work together?
Oh, that is such a good question. And the person who commented to that, maybe you have some ideas. I don't have an easy answer other than getting people together. I think there's, and I've seen some examples here where there's such a fear of losing even more funding. So there's competition between communities and you think from the outside, and it's easy for me to say that from the outside, to say, oh, could you not just work together? Yet I understand all the different, the way people are stretched and funding is stretched, and yes, and there's competition for the limited funding, apparently competition. So I don't have the answer, but I hope whoever made the comment has some thoughts on that and could share them with all of us.
Okay, the next question is, there are more rural and remote areas in Canada because of its geography. So are you seeing instances of more social isolation of older people in Canada than, say, in Europe, for example?
I would say no. And and I'm just saying that off the top of my head. In fact, I'm looking at that very issue in a research study, and unfortunately I don't have the results yet, but my hypothesis is that there's no difference.
Okay.
Rural urban difference, and I would say that because I would say actually rural might have a certain advantage of being more close-knit, and this is what I was talking about, the strengths in rural, that greater connectedness. But in a few, well, actually, probably in a few days, I will have results, and at some point I will publish on that. So we'll see.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how can the age-friendly agenda be made to appeal to all age groups, given that everyone is aging and therefore personally affected?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That has been a big issue in terms of at the local context, even promoting age friendliness and making sure that it's not perceived as just, and I put just in quotation marks, being for older people, but for all ages. So a number of communities here in Manitoba are actually saying age-friendly for all ages. It's a community for all ages to make sure to see that it's not just for one group. I think one of the most direct ways to involve younger people and really make it for all ages is if there is a steering committee, an advisory committee to involve young people. And I've seen that, and I think that brings that all ages truly into the picture. And if anybody else has other suggestions, I'd be again really happy to hear them.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one final question because we're nearing the end of the hour, and then if you do have other questions, feel free to contact the IFA after I send out the wrap-up. But the final question is, you mentioned the capacity issue as a challenge to becoming age-friendly. Do you have any experience in building capacity locally to increase leadership and direction locally to becoming age-friendly? For example, training residents to take a lead on becoming more age-friendly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can give you the example of what Manitoba has done in terms of, it kind of gets at the capacity building, is getting communities together for sharing workshops, if you will. So it says, if you come together and you can showcase some good examples, that will help communities that are struggling. So that's one way of building capacity. A more direct other way, yeah, I mean, the example given, I suppose could work. I have not seen that in action, but I could see that as a possibility. I kind of like this idea of bringing people together and learning from each other. So you'd have representatives from different age-friendly steering committees, and they come together and they talk. I like this idea of, well, first of all, the sharing information, but also people like to hear from similar communities and people who are in the same boat. So if you kind of see, yeah, they're like us. So how come they can do it? And then the people who have a little further ahead can then share some of the examples and encourage the ones who are maybe struggling with some of the issues.
Thank you. So in closing, I just wanted to read this final comment, and it says, "Thank you for a wonderful presentation, many great considerations shared." And I just wanted to echo that sentiment. Thank you for this wonderful presentation on behalf of the IFA, and we really appreciate it. And the session has been recorded, so we will circulate that as well. And Dr. Minnick, did you have any final comments?
No, I don't. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.